Hey guys, it's Christa Watson here from ChristaQuilts.com, and I'm excited to teach you how to bind your quilts by machine. I'm using my Infrastructure quilt, but of course you can do this technique on any quilt you like. Once your binding strips are cut to their desired width, you want to sew them together to create one long continuous strip. I'm taking my binding strips and sewing them together at 90-degree angles. It's really easy to just sew from corner to corner with a little bit extra sticking off. This is going to get cut off once I'm done, and I'm going to press these seams open. Now if you want to, you can go ahead and mark the sewing line, or you can just eyeball it like I've done here. Next, trim off one end at a 45-degree angle and press the binding wrong sides together. Here's how I attach the binding to the back side of the quilt. I align the raw edges of the binding with the raw edges of the quilt top, starting about 10 inches away from the end of the binding so that I have room to join the ends when I'm done. I'm stitching with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and I stop stitching a 1/4 inch away from the corner of the quilt. I fold it and create a crease so I know exactly where to stop. I stitch off the side of the quilt, and then I'm going to start stitching after I take care of the mitered corner. To miter the corner, I do what's called a funky fold. I pull the strip up so that it's nice and aligned, and I pinch it and fold it back down upon itself, aligning the raw edges again so I can continue sewing. Make sure you go back and watch this several times so you can see what I'm doing. I'm yanking on the threads so that they don't come off and create a big mess on the back, and then I continue to stitch with a 1/4 inch seam. I'm going to do this on all 4 sides of the quilt. In just a second, I'll speed it up so you can watch me stitching without it taking so long. After I sew the binding to all 4 sides of the quilt, I'm leaving about a 10-inch gap so that I can join the beginning and ending tails of the binding so it becomes seamless. I'll show you how to finish the ends in just a second. Take a look and see how I attach the rest of the binding. Here's how I join the ends. First of all, I want to make sure that I close up that 10-inch gap. I trim off the extra binding strips, but make sure that there's enough so that I can put one end of the binding inside the other. You'll see that I'm marking the 45-degree angle so that those are going to match up when I sew them together. Because neither side has seam allowances, I have to add 1/2 inch to one side of the binding. So I take that marked line, measure 1/2 inch, and then trim that off. It's hard to see it on the video, but I've drawn it so that I can see the line. Then I take the 2 ends and I pin them together so that I can sew them with a really nice, accurate 1/4 inch seam allowance. Once I'm done sewing this seam allowance, I'm going to trim off the little dog ears that are sticking out on the ends, and I'm going to finger press that seam open. You can do it with an iron if you want to, but my fingers work fine here. Then I'm going to close it back up and continue stitching with a 1/4 inch seam to secure the complete binding onto the back of the quilt. Next, I'm going to bring it to the front and secure with a decorative stitch. You can use any decorative stitch on your sewing machine to add an interesting element to your binding and make it become part of the design. I'm actually using the same decorative stitch I used to quilt my quilt. Make sure you go and watch my previous video for tips on how I quilted it and selected my stitch. So this is going to take a little bit of time, but it's definitely much faster than finishing by hand. I've sewn the binding on with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and now I'm covering up the sewn line. I'm trying not to cut off any points, but if I do, it's not the end of the world. So I'm using a stiletto to really make sure I hold the binding in place. When I get to this corner, I'm going to fold up the bottom of the binding first and then fold over the side. That automatically creates a miter at the front. Notice how I round the corner. I come all the way to the end and I watch where the needle position is, then I rotate the quilt and continue stitching that decorative stitch. Because I'm using a very busy fabric print with matching thread, It's not that obvious to see the stitching and it kind of blends in. I use the stiletto, I lift up the needle, I do whatever I need to do so that I'm sewing nice and smoothly. And I'm going to do this around the entire perimeter of the quilt. Here's a little bit more of the ending. When I get back to my original point where I started, I'm just going to stitch right on top of my previous line of stitching, locking some of the stitches in place, and then it's all done.